Rain poured down in cold, heavy sheets, turning the city streets into a maze of shimmering puddles. The night air was thick with the scent of damp pavement and distant car exhaust. The kind of night where most people hurried home, eager to escape the chill. But for one little girl, there was no home to run to. She sat curled up beneath a flickering streetlight, her thin arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her clothes were torn and soaked through, clinging to her small frame like a second skin. Strangers walked past her without so much as a glance, their umbrellas shielding them from the rain. And from her, she had learned not to expect kindness. The world had long since taught her that people rarely stopped for someone like her. A young black girl alone on the streets, invisible to the world, but tonight, someone did stop. A sleek black car, the kind that belonged to someone important, slowed as it approached the curb. The driver, a sharply dressed man in his early 40s, peered out through the tinted window, his eyes sharp and calculating, locked onto the girl for a brief moment. Something about her seemed familiar. He couldn't place it, but the sight of her, drenched and shivering, sent an uncomfortable twist through his chest. Damien Westwood wasn't the kind of man who usually took detours. His world revolved around billion-dollar deals, high-rise boardrooms, and exclusive penthouse parties. People knew him as ruthless in business, cold even, a self-made millionaire who had climbed his way up from nothing. He had little patience for weakness, and yet he hesitated. Maybe it was the way she was clutching something so tightly in her tiny fist. Maybe it was the way her eyes, though weary and dull, still held a flicker of quiet defiance. Whatever it was, Damien found himself stepping out of his car, feeling the icy rain soak into his expensive shoes as he walked toward her. "Hey, kid," he called out, his deep voice cutting through the night. The girl flinched but didn't look up. He crouched beside her, lowering himself to her level. "What are you doing out here?" No answer. Damien sighed, glancing around. No parents, no shelter in sight. Just a lonely child, lost in a city that didn't care. He wasn't sure why he cared. Maybe it was guilt, maybe curiosity. But before he could think twice, he found himself offering his hand. "Come on, you can't stay here." The girl hesitated. She had learned the hard way not to trust strangers. But something in his voice, despite its gruffness, didn't sound dangerous. And truthfully, she had nowhere else to go. Slowly she placed her trembling fingers into his palm. As he helped her to her feet, Damien finally caught a glimpse of the object she had been holding on to so desperately. It was a small worn locket, the kind that had clearly seen better days. The gold was faded, the chain tangled, but it was clear that it meant something to her. Damien's breath caught in his throat. He had seen that locket before, years ago. His pulse pounded in his ears as he carefully reached for it, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The girl immediately jerked back, clutching it to her chest, her wide eyes now filled with fear. "Where did you get that?" Damien's voice was sharper than he intended, but he couldn't help it. His mind was racing, memories crashing into him like waves. The girl shook her head, stepping back, as if suddenly realizing she had made a mistake by trusting him. Damien's heart hammered as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just any locket. This locket belonged to someone he had lost, someone he had spent years trying to forget, and now it was here, clutched in the hands of a homeless girl who had just stepped into his life on a rainy night. Who was she? And what did this mean? Damien had no idea, but one thing was certain. His life would never be the same after this night. The girl's hands trembled as she clutched the locket tighter, her dark eyes darting toward the man in front of her. Damien Westwood, tall, powerful, and completely out of place in the middle of the wet, empty street, stared at her, as if she had just turned his entire world upside down. His expression, once unreadable, was now laced with something raw, shock, maybe even fear. The silence between them felt heavy, the kind that carried secrets neither of them fully understood. The girl swallowed hard and took a step back. "It's mine," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Damien's jaw tightened. "Where did you get it? I told you, it's mine." Something in the way she said it made his pulse quicken. His mind was already racing, trying to piece together a puzzle that shouldn't exist. That locket, it belonged to someone he had known a long time ago, someone he had lost. His fingers curled into a fist. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, uncertainty flickering across her face before she answered. "Riley, Riley." It didn't tell him much, but it was a start. He studied her hollow cheeks, her fragile frame, the way she hugged herself like she was trying to disappear. She looked young, maybe 10 or 11, but there was something about her. Eyes that seemed older, like she had seen things no child should ever have to see. Damien exhaled, pushing a hand through his rain-dampened hair. He didn't know what he was doing. He had never been the kind of man to get involved in other people's problems. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of a storm with a homeless girl who somehow had a piece of his past in her hands. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. Whatever this was, it wasn't his problem. But something inside him, something he hadn't felt in years, kept him rooted in place. "You're coming with me," he said, his voice firm. Riley's eyes widened with panic, and she shook her head violently. "No." Damien sighed. "I'm not gonna hurt you." She still didn't move. He softened his tone, trying to sound less like a businessman closing a deal and more like a person she could trust. "Look, you can't stay out here. It's cold. You're soaked. Just for one night. You'll be safe." Riley's lips pressed together, her little hands still gripping the locket, like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. After what felt like an eternity, she gave a small, reluctant nod. Damien didn't waste another second. He opened the car door for her, half expecting her to change her mind, but she climbed in slowly, curling up in the seat like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. As he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced at her from the corner of his eye. She was shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Without a word, he reached into the back seat and grabbed a dry jacket, placing it over her small shoulders. She flinched at first, but then hesitantly pulled it tighter around her. Damien pulled out onto the street, his grip on the steering wheel firm. The rain continued to pound against the windshield, the city lights blurring past as he drove toward his penthouse. His mind wouldn't stop racing. Who was she? How did she get that locket? And why did she look so familiar? For the first time in years, Damien felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Uneasy. By the time they reached his building, Riley had drifted into an uneasy sleep, her small frame curled up beneath his jacket. Damien didn't wake her right away. Instead, he sat there in the quiet hum of the car, watching the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. She looked so fragile, so breakable. He had seen people at their lowest before, business partners who lost everything, men who fell from power. But this was different. She was just a kid. He shook off the thought and stepped out of the car. As soon as he opened her door, Riley stirred, her eyes snapping open with fear. "You're safe," Damien said quickly. Realizing how disoriented she must be, Riley blinked, as if remembering where she was, and slowly climbed out of the car. The lobby was sleek, modern, and quiet. the kind of place where people like her never set foot. She shrunk beside him as they stepped inside, her sneakers leaving damp prints on the marble floor. The doorman raised an eyebrow at Damien, but said nothing. No one ever questioned him. When they reached his penthouse, Riley hesitated in the doorway. "Come in," Damien said. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes darting around. Everything was spotless, expensive, the kind of luxury she had only seen in movies. She shifted uncomfortably, gripping the locket again like she was afraid it would disappear. "You can sleep here tonight," Damien said, nodding toward the plush couch. "Bathrooms down the hall. There are extra towels." Riley didn't move. He exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. "Are you hungry?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. He didn't know why, but that one small action hit him harder than it should have. Without another word, he headed to the kitchen. He wasn't much of a cook, but he could at least make something simple. As he moved around the kitchen, Riley stood by the counter, watching him cautiously, like she still wasn't sure if she could trust him. When he placed a plate of food in front of her, she didn't eat right away. Instead, she just stared at it. "You don't have to wait," he said, nodding toward the food. She finally picked up the fork, taking small, careful bites. He noticed the way her hands shook, how she kept glancing at him between bites, like she expected him to take them plate away at any moment. "How long have you been on the streets?" he asked after a moment. Riley didn't answer. Damien leaned back against the counter. "You don't have to tell me anything, but I need to know one thing." She looked up, her dark eyes wary. "That locket," he said, his voice quieter now. "Where did you really get it?" Riley's grip on it tightened again. She looked down, as if debating whether to speak. Then, finally she whispered, "It belonged to my mom." Damien's breath hitched. Something cold slid down his spine, something he wasn't ready to face. Because if she was telling the truth, if that locket had really belonged to her mother, then there was only one possible explanation. Damien knew her mother, and if that was true, then Riley wasn't just some random girl he had found on the street. She was a part of his past, a past he had tried to forget, and now it had come back for him. Damien felt his throat go, dry as Riley's words echoed in his head. "It belonged to my mom." His fingers twitched at his sides, his heartbeat thudding like a distant drum. He had spent years burying the past, locking away memories he never wanted to face again. And yet, here it was, staring him in the face, worn, frayed, hanging from the neck of a girl who had no idea what she had just unleashed. He swallowed hard. "What was your mother's name?" Riley hesitated, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the locket. She looked away, as if saying the name out loud might somehow make things worse. Then, barely above a whisper, she answered, "Maria." The room seemed to shrink around him. Maria. The name sent a sharp pang through his chest, unlocking memories he had forced himself to forget. The laughter of a young woman, the warmth of her voice, the way she used to wear that very same locket every single day. Maria had been everything to him once, and then, just like that, she was gone. His world tilted slightly as he exhaled, running, a hand over his face. He had spent years convincing himself that she had moved on, that whatever they had was in the past. But now, standing before him, was proof that their story had never really ended. "Maria." He forced the name out, his voice barely holding steady. "She was my mom," Riley interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp. "She died a few months ago." The words hit him harder than he expected. He stared at her, trying to process the weight of what she had just said. Maria was gone, the woman who once meant everything to him, the woman he had walked away from all those years ago, was dead. And this girl, this lost, shivering girl, was her daughter. His daughter. Damien's chest tightened as the realization struck him. He didn't want to believe it, but the timelines made sense. The age, the locket, the resemblance. He had been too blinded by shock to see it before. But now, looking at Riley, really looking at her, he saw it, the shape of her face, the curve of her jaw, the eyes, his eyes. A rush of emotions flooded through him, so strong he had to grip the edge of the counter just to steady himself. Your father. His voice was hoarse. What happened to him? Riley shrugged, but there was pain beneath the gesture. Don't know. Mom never talked about him. Her voice hardened slightly. Guess he didn't care enough to stick around? The words stung, though he knew she wasn't saying them to hurt him. She didn't know. She had no idea who he was. Damien's mind raced. He had walked away from Maria when he was younger, chasing success, chasing a future that didn't involve love or responsibility. He had convinced himself it was for the best, that she was better off without him. But now, standing in his kitchen was proof of everything he had missed. A daughter he had never known existed. A daughter who had been living on the streets, alone, after losing the only parent she had ever known. Guilt wrapped around his chest like a vice. Riley yawned, exhaustion pulling at her small frame. She had been through so much already, and here he was, drowning in his own emotions, while she stood there, barely keeping herself upright. Come on, he said, his voice softer now. You need sleep. She hesitated again, then gave a small nod. He led her toward the guest room, flicking on the soft bedside lamp. She stepped inside carefully, glancing around like she was afraid she might break something. You're safe, here, Damien reassured her. Riley didn't respond. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, still gripping the locket. He hesitated in the doorway. Good night, Riley. She didn't say it back, but he hadn't expected her to. As he turned to leave, her small voice stopped him. Are you going to leave too? The question nearly broke him. He turned back, meeting her eyes. They weren't just questioning. They were pleading. And in that moment, he knew. He had failed her once, without even knowing it. But he wouldn't fail her again. No, he said, firmly. I'm not going anywhere. Riley studied him for a moment, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. Then, slowly, she nodded. It was small, subtle, but it was enough. Damien turned off the light and closed the door behind him, leaning against the wall as he exhaled deeply. His mind was still spinning, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about making things right. This was about family. His family. And for the first time in a long, long time, Damien Westwood knew exactly what he had to do.